Mr. President.
Senator for Texas.
Mr. President, I wish we were not here facing these issues yet again. In recent days, our nation has seen yet another horrific school shooting. In September of last year, I stood on this Senate floor and tried to pass legislation to stop these school shootings. There have been too damn many of them. I've been there on the ground at too damn many of them. Santa Fe High School in Texas, about 45 minutes away from my house. The morning of that shooting, I got the call within minutes of the shooting. I was down on campus just over an hour after it occurred. I saw the tragedy, the tears, the grieving parents, the children in shock. Uvalde, I was there shortly after that shooting as well. The horror, the mayhem. Too many of our children have been murdered by deranged lunatics. Mr. President, when you and I were kids, this wasn't a thing. When you went to school, when I went to school, there wasn't a single day that I woke up going to school worried that some idiot, some sociopath was going to shoot up the school. You might worry about getting punched at recess, but this didn't happen 30, 40, 50 years ago. Now it is a brutal reality over and over again. There are lots of causes that we could debate for a long time. Causes in our culture, causes of disconnected, emotionally disturbed young men who want to become famous. I think Columbine may have started this whole tragic cycle, where an angry young person seeks to lash out by murdering little kids. With respect to becoming famous, one rule I try to follow is that I will never say the names of these mass murderers. If they want to be well known, I hope everyone in elected office, I'd like everyone in the news media to follow that rule as well. They deserve to be forgotten in utter obscurity. But we also have an obligation to stop this. Every time there's a mass murder, there's a pattern that plays out. Number one, there's an expression of grief, of love for the community. There are millions of us who lift the community up in prayer. Inevitably, that produces a response from the political left, where they scream in unison, thoughts and prayers aren't enough. I'll tell you, Mr. President, I believe in the power of prayer. And I will continue praying for communities that are hurting, whether from a natural disaster or a horrific crime or anything else. But I agree with the sentiment. Thoughts and prayers are not enough. That is exactly right. We need action. And what is so infuriating is every time there's a mass shooting, Democrats in this chamber stand up and they don't actually want to do something to stop the murderers. Instead, they want another gun control bill to disarm law-abiding citizens that won't actually stop the murders, that won't actually protect our kids. In September of last year, I introduced legislation that would be the most far-reaching school safety legislation ever enacted. It would double the number of police officers on campuses, devoting $15 billion to to putting armed police officers on campus to protect our kids, the single most important step we can do. It would also devote $10 billion for mental health professionals on campuses, because so many of these troubled murderers had warning signs leaping off the page. It also devotes $2.56 billion for physical security at schools to help enhance the security at schools. When I introduced this bill, it first came up as an amendment on the much-touted bipartisan gun control bill last year that did nothing to stop violent crime. But it satisfied the left-wing donors of the Democrat Party. When my amendment was voted on the Senate floor, I'm sorry to say every single Democrat in this chamber voted no. All of them, every one. Afterwards, I went to this floor, I stood on this floor, and I tried to pass the bill by unanimous consent. And when that happened, the senator from Connecticut stood up and objected. Now, I have to say, leading up to that unanimous consent request, numerous reporters had asked me in the hallway, why are the Democrats objecting to this? And I was forced to say, I do not know. Because to date, they have not articulated any reason. They have not explained why they oppose more police officers in schools. They have not explained why they oppose more mental health counselors in schools. They have not explained why they oppose more funding for enhanced physical security in schools. So I was quite interested to hear the senator from Connecticut give his reasons. I was disappointed that day. The senator from Connecticut stood up and uttered two words, I object. And he sat down. That was it. His answer was just no. Mr. President, I stood on this floor then, and I said something that I said, God forbid there is going to be another school shooting. I pray to God there isn't. But we're going to find a day when another one of these happens, another deranged lunatic commits this kind of mass murder. And if there is not a police officer at the front door, I said, remember this moment. Remember this moment. Because if the senator from Connecticut had not stood up and said, I object, this bill would have passed the Senate unanimously. If this bill had passed into law, $15 billion to double the number of police officers on campus, and that was available at public schools, at private schools, at parochial schools. What that would have meant is that there's a very real possibility an armed police officer would have been at the front door of the Covenant School in Nashville. Now, as we look at what happened, every one of us that's a parent or a grandparent is beyond horrified at what sort of deranged person murders little children. But we also know that that shooter came to the front door and shot the front door open. If this bill had passed, funding for school security, that front door could have been made more secure, so the shooter couldn't have blasted in. But even more importantly, look, many of us have watched the body cam footage. It's horrific, it's deeply disturbing, but I'll tell you, it's also awe-inspiring. You saw the Nashville police officers arrive on campus about 15 minutes after the shooting began. They enter the campus, they're scared, they don't know what's going on, but they're looking for the shooter. They're wearing bulletproof vests, they're searching for the shooter, they're going up the stairs. and they hear the sound of gunshots, and the police officers do what police officers should do. They head towards the shots. They risk their lives, and they encounter the shooter and shoot the shooter dead. The heroism of those officers saved lives that day. If this bill had passed, those officers might not have been 15 minutes away. They might have been standing at the front door. The purpose of this bill was to have those officers at the front door so that when the deranged shooter showed up and tried to shoot in the door, the officers could stop the shooter right there and then, which would have meant that not a single child needed to die. I told this body, if we didn't act, the consequences would be horrific. And yet the sad reality, I do not understand why our Democrat colleagues in this body do not support having police officers keep our kids safe. Why, when it comes to this issue, the only thing that interests them is disarming the people at home who pose no threat rather than protecting our kids. As I said, Mr. President, I wish I wasn't back here today. I wish this had passed last year. I wish Democrats were willing to work together on really solving this problem. But sadly, this pattern replays over and over again. I have two different bills that I'm going to put before this body, but I'm going to start with the first one, the one I've just described. $15 billion for police officers to double the number of police officers on campus to protect our kids. You know, when you go to the bank and you deposit money in the bank, there are armed police officers in the bank. Why? Because we want to protect the money we save. Why on earth do we protect a stupid deposit more than our children? If they're parents that don't want police officers protecting their kids, I don't know those parents. Well, we have the opportunity right now to double the police officers on campus and keep kids safe. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-1082, which is at the desk. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. Reserving the right to object, as I understand it, the Senator has two unanimous consent requests. I will object to both, and I will make my comments when the Senator makes his second unanimous consent request. So for now, on this first objection, on this first request, so as to save time, I'll wait for my comments on the second and simply object to this one. I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
So history is repeated. We still don't have an explanation as to why police officers on campus is not a good thing. Maybe we'll get it. We were told we'll get a speech. So we'll see what that is. That's what happened last time. All right. The Democrats don't like that. Let me give you a simpler bill. A simpler bill that would spend unused COVID education funds. There are over $100 billion in funds that Congress has appropriated to the schools. That under the restrictions put in place from the Democrats, that money cannot be used for school safety. That money cannot be used to make our kids safer. In September, I introduced this bill as well. It's a one-page bill. It's a very simple bill. It says the schools can choose to use that money to enhance school safety. It says if a school wants to use some of that money to hire a police officer, the school can do so. It says if the school wants to use some of that money to enhance their physical security, the school can do so. It gives flexibility to the schools. In September, when I attempted to pass this, I asked, why would anyone possibly oppose this? I don't know how a Democrat senator goes home to your state. I don't know how you go home to Connecticut or New Jersey or Michigan and look in the eyes of a superintendent, look in the eyes of a teacher and say, no, I will not let you spend the money on school security. Doesn't matter if your kids are afraid. Doesn't matter if your teachers are afraid. We, the Democrats in Congress, know better than you, and you may not spend $1 of this on school security. And let me be clear. This would have passed in September, except for two magic words uttered by the senator from Connecticut. I object. Now, last time he went on a discourse about how this was not the full legislative process, that we hadn't negotiated with him, and goodness, that must be comfort to the parents who are scared at home, that we hadn't sat there in a detailed negotiation. Every year, this body passes bill after bill after bill by unanimous consent. Every senator here knows how to do that. The reason it doesn't go through committee process, by the way, is because the Democrats control the committees and they don't want to debate this. So if you hear a bunch of process arguments from the senator from Connecticut, gosh, what he said last time, this isn't real. It is only not real because the Democrats are objecting. That's what makes it not real, because they are blocking it. But to say it's not passing because I'm objecting is like the arsonist complaining there's a fire. I ask you in all seriousness, Mr. President, how do you explain to a parent back home? How do you explain to a superintendent? How do you explain to a teacher? There's something wrong with you having the ability to spend this money on school safety. I don't know how to articulate that. I am looking forward to hearing it. We'll see if we do. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-1081, which is at the desk. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. The senator is right. I have very little interest in engaging on the merits of these proposals in a dialogue on the floor of the Senate, because they are not serious attempts to make our kids safer. These unanimous consent requests that Senator Cruz makes, they're going to get a lot of clicks online. The confrontation that he's looking for will probably lead to a bunch of cable news appearances being booked, but it's not going to save any kids' lives. The senator knows this is not how the Senate works. This isn't an autocracy. It's not a dictatorship. You don't come down here and introduce a piece of legislation and 2 minutes later demand that the entirety of the Senate agree to it without any debate, any negotiation. The senator says these are the same bills he introduced last year. But as far as I can tell, he introduced the bills he's making unanimous consent requests on minutes ago. They're not even fully formed pieces of legislation. This thing is so ham-handed, one of the bills, that there's literally brackets and question marks in the text. The legislative drafters, at least in the version that I see, haven't made decisions on when the money is being spent. The senator says that there's this pattern that plays out after these shootings in which Democrats make demands about taking people's guns away, but aren't serious about making our kids safer. Is that how it played out after the shooting in Uvalde? Is that what happened last summer? No, that's not what happened. What happened last summer after the shooting in the senator's state is that serious members of this body who are more interested in legislating than enacting political theater, sat down together and negotiated a bill to save children's lives. Did it solve all of the problems in this country? Did it guarantee every child's safety? No, it did not. But let's be clear. Senator Cruz never expressed one iota of interest in being part of those negotiations. Other Republican senators did. And while I understand he objects to the gun provisions in that bill, guess what? That bill also put $15 billion into school safety, into mental health, into hardening our schools, into community anti-gun violence programs. I can't speak about the other members of the group that authored that bill, but I never got a single phone call from Senator Cruz during the month of negotiations suggesting that we add the language he's talking about to that proposal. Last summer, there were serious legislators who come to this floor to enact legislation to set aside our differences and pass legislation that makes our kids safe, willing to make compromise. Senator Cruz didn't even sniff that room. He references the unanimous consent request he made later last year that I objected to. I think I suggested then, as I suggest now, that the result of that unanimous consent request was to create political theater and book cable news hits. The result was not going to be a piece of legislation being enacted. And I figured that if I was wrong about that, if the senator's purpose was to pass a piece of legislation, that the result of my objection would have been to get outreach from the senator's office, to try to figure out a way forward, to try to find a compromise. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. But not once did Senator Cruz reach out and say, let's work together to get this done, which confirmed my suspicions that these unanimous consent requests are not about passing legislation. They're just about creating conflict for the sake of conflict. This legislation was introduced minutes ago, so I'm not able to debate the merits of it on the floor of the Senate right now. It appears to make a whole bunch of changes to the not-for-profit security grant program that the presiding officer knows very well, changes that have little to do with school safety. It seems that there's a bunch of processes changes to the not-for-profit security grant program. That's probably something worth having a conversation with the chairman of the committee about before we pass it by unanimous consent. It makes broad structural changes to Title IV, which is a very important program to schools. They use that money for school security, but they also use that money for a host of other important programs. That's probably worth having a conversation with the members of the Education Committee about. A very quick look at this bill suggests that it likely opens up the use of those funds to arming teachers in our school. I think that's a terrible idea. This is all to say that this isn't how the process works. You don't drop a piece of legislation on the floor of the Senate and 2 minutes later demand that the whole Senate pass it. You do that if your intent is to create conflict for the purposes of publicity. I don't know what the senator's intentions are, but if that was your intention, this is what you would do. If you were interested in actually passing something, you would have dialed up the authors of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and asked to be part of that negotiation. You'd have reached out to my office after the objection last year and said, what's your objections? Let's sit down and do something together. That's how legislation gets passed in this place. I know because I've done it on this topic. And I'm not saying that the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act solved the problem. I know we have more work to do. I know it because I spend time with those same families every single week. I know it because I live in a dangerous neighborhood in South Hartford. I talk to those kids who have to fear for their life when they go to school. And that's why my purpose for being in the Senate is to work like hell across the aisle through compromise, not by coming down here, dropping a bill on the floor, and then immediately demanding that the entire Senate vote for it. That's not how we save kids' lives. Compromising, working towards compromise, behind the scenes, not always in front of the cameras. I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
as the senator from Connecticut walks away because he's unwilling to debate the topic, I will note several things he said not a word about. But let's focus on, he said, oh, this bill is very hard to figure out. It's very complicated. Well, the second bill, the one he just objected to, is all of 1 page long. I'm going to read you the statutory text. The senator from New Jersey here. He is a learned senator. It says the unobligated balance of funds made available in the COVID funding, and I won't read the actual citation, but the COVID funding. The unobligated funds made available shall be made available to local educational agencies to keep elementary schools and secondary schools served by such agencies physically secure. That is the entirety of the bill. You can use the $100+ billion that Congress has appropriated to make schools safer. Now, not a word from the senator from Connecticut addressed that bill. He just said, I object. And as for his caterwauling, that the first bill, gosh, he can't figure out what's in it. You don't do it this way. I will point out the first time I introduced it, it was Cruz Barrasso, and every senator voted on it because I introduced it as an amendment to the bill the senator from Connecticut introduced. Now, mind you, in the wake of Uvalde, with great fanfare, senator from Connecticut passed a meaningless gun control bill that did nothing to prevent what happened in Nashville, that's not going to prevent the next mass murder. Why? Because it doesn't target criminals. It doesn't go after the bad guys. It doesn't put police officers in a position to protect our kids. I find some rich irony that the senator from Connecticut suggested, gosh, the purpose of this is to get on cable news. I don't know if the senator from Connecticut has difficulty getting on the news, but I can assure you that I don't. What I do know is this is about stopping these damn murders. The senator from Connecticut suggests this is about conflict with him. I can assure him very few people outside of Connecticut have any awareness of what he says. Why is that? Well, for one thing, when we did this last time, there were 0 reporters in the gallery. Now there are 2. The corporate media doesn't report on this. If you turn on cable news, they won't tell you that the reason there wasn't a police officer at the Covenant School is because every Democrat in the Senate voted against it. Corporate media won't tell you the reason the Covenant School couldn't spend these funds on hiring a police officer and hardening that front door so you couldn't shoot through it is because the senator from Connecticut objected. He knows to an absolute certainty that a dishonest press corps will not tell anybody. By the way, he made great fanfare of saying, well, the legislative text has a bracket. What he didn't tell you is his staff gave him an old version of the bill, not the one that is filed, and he was focused in particular on the one edit that was made, which was to change the fiscal year because we're now 1 year later. So it was to alter the date from the appropriate date last year to the appropriate date this year. That was the amendment, and he reported, well, gosh, no one knows what's in this. You've all voted on it. You know what he didn't say once? Why having more police officers in schools is a bad thing. He didn't talk at all about $10 billion for mental health counselors. Mr. President, I'm tired of these games. I told you that he would give you process arguments, and oh boy did he. He said, gosh, Cruz didn't call me. I guess his feelings were hurt. I've also done this a long time. I've seen the political posturing that too many Democrats do on this issue. Senator from Connecticut suggests that this is a newfound interest. I've served 11 years on the Senate Judiciary Committee. I have fought for 11 years. I've introduced legislation after legislation after legislation to lock up gun criminals. If you commit a crime with a gun, you should be prosecuted and go to jail. If you're a felon or fugitive or someone with serious mental illness and you try to illegally buy guns, you should be prosecuted and sent to jail. And repeatedly, Democrats block those bills. The sad reality of this body is if you're a mom at home who wants to be able to protect your kids, the Democrats are really eager to disarm you. But if you're a gangbanger in Chicago, they're not interested in a gun task force to lock you up and take the murderers off the street. Mr. President, why is it an unreasonable question to ask what's wrong with having more police officers to protect our kids? And I want to show you how little interest the Democrats have. The senator from Connecticut is gone. He gave his little speech and ran away. This is supposed to be the world's greatest deliberative body. But as long as the press doesn't do its job, the senator from Connecticut can send out a fundraising email tonight to all the gun control groups saying, guess what, we're coming after the Second Amendment. Please click here. That's cold comfort to the parents who are scared at home right now, to the kids who are scared at home right now. The solutions put forth by the Democrats in this body are not designed to stop crime. This bill is. You know, for a long time, in the weeks and months following Uvalde, there's been a talking point raised by the left on Twitter and echoed just moments ago by the senator from Connecticut that says, well, we don't want more police because the police don't stop these crimes. And they point to Uvalde. Now, I will say, having been in Uvalde right after that shooting, what the police officers did there was tragic. Hundreds of officers showed up at that school, and for an hour and 14 minutes, they did nothing. They didn't go in and take out the shooter. That was true even as shots rang out repeatedly. That was true even as little children were calling 911, begging for help. For over an hour, they didn't go in. I agree the conduct of law enforcement that day was inexplicable and indefensible. I will say, when I went to Uvalde immediately after the shooting, senior law enforcement there in Uvalde sat in a room and lied to me and lied to John Cornyn and lied to Greg Abbott, the governor, about what happened. The story they described was utterly false, as would come out in the days to follow. One of the things they claimed that day is they said, oh, an officer was there when the shooter arrived. That was not true. You want to know why having an officer there matters? Watch the body cam footage. In Nashville, those heroic officers who heard the sounds of gunshots and ran towards them, risking their lives. There are children who are, thank God, alive because of the heroism of those officers. Is it too much to ask how things would have been different if the officers could have been at the front door to begin with? They could have been. If not for Senate Democrats. Now, the senator from Connecticut said, gosh, he hasn't had time to read this bill that he's voted on before, that he's objected to before, but, you know, it really did make his head hurt to have to read this legislative language. Well, I tell you what, we're getting ready to go on a two-week recess. When we come back, we can do this again. Senator from Connecticut can take 2 weeks to read the bill. It's not complicated. And then I look forward to the senator from Connecticut telling me why, on behalf of the Democrat Party, he thinks having police officers on school campuses is a bad idea. And by the way, I would note, even though it's just the senator from Connecticut objecting, every Democrat in this body voted against this bill, and not a single Democrat has come to the floor to say they disagree with what the senator from Connecticut is doing. When he stands up and does this objection, he's doing it on behalf of the whole Democrat Party. I'll make an invitation to any one of you. If there is a Democrat member in this body that actually believes that having police officers protect our kids would be a good thing, that actually believes having mental health counselors in our schools would be a good thing, that actually believes that providing funding to enhance physical security in schools would be a good thing, then come join me. I don't have a whole lot of optimism that's going to happen. But if it doesn't, this is all going to happen again. The bill passed last fall. Nobody thinks it is going to do anything to stop mass murders. Wasn't designed to do that. Was designed to assuage gun control activists. If you want to stop mass murders, go after the murderers. If you want to stop mass murders, protect our kids. We can do this. But to do it, we've got to have someone from the Democrat Party willing to stand up and say, let's actually get it done. Right now, today, the answer from Democrats is thoughts and prayers. I agree, thoughts and prayers are not enough. How about action? And by the way, they do want action. They'd be happy to confiscate all the law-abiding citizens' firearms, which doesn't work and wouldn't have kept anyone safe. How about action to keep our kids safe? If the Democrats hadn't objected in September of 2022, this horrific murder in Nashville could have been prevented. It should have been prevented. And we have a responsibility to do everything we can to prevent the next one. I yield the floor.
For Connecticut.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. One of the benefits of sitting in the chair as the senator from Maine is currently, is that you get to hear a wide variety of views from our colleagues. And I have had the opportunity over the past several weeks while sitting in the chair to hear my Republican colleagues talk about their concerns regarding the lifting of Title 42. They are concerns that are very often shared in many respects by Democrats as well. But it's really important that we level set the facts when we're talking about what's happening at the border right now, as the pandemic authority to stop people from applying for asylum is, as required by law, being lifted. It's really important that we understand that in this debate, there's a lot of spinning. There's a lot of myths. There are some just outright mistruths that are being spread about what's happening at the border and what has been happening at the border. And so I'm down on the floor just for a few minutes today to try to talk about a short list of those myths and untruths that are being spread, sometimes on this floor, but very often on social media and on cable news, so that we can find a way to have a functional conversation between Republicans and Democrats of good faith who actually want to make progress. First, my sense is that there were a lot of conservatives out there and a lot of haters of President Biden who were kind of rooting for chaos at the border. We're hoping that there was just going to be this overwhelming flood of crossings and apprehensions at the border when Title 42 was lifted. Here's maybe the most important thing to say. It didn't happen. In fact, if you look at the number of people who were showing up at the southwest border right before Title 42 expired, and I will admit that that number was elevated, we have seen half as many people crossing in the last 4 days as were crossing right before Title 42 expired. 4,000, 5,000 people, that is still a lot of people per day who are being apprehended at the border. But it does not match the doomsday predictions that many on the right were making. So I think it's just important to acknowledge that fact, because if you read the newspapers, if you paid attention to cable news, you would have thought that the minute that Title 42 ended, there was going to be a doubling, a tripling of the number of people who showed up at the border. That didn't happen, in fact. 50% less people are showing up. Now, that may not hold. I can't promise that that's the future trajectory, but I'm going to tell you a story today about why that happens, and it's connected to things Joe Biden did. The second level-setting exercise I want to engage in is this idea that we should be in just lockdown fear of all these people who are coming to the United States at the southern border, that there is something uniquely dangerous about immigrants writ large, but more specifically undocumented immigrants. Now, this is a trope that's been around for as long as the United States has existed, that we should fear immigrants coming to this country. But we now have data to tell us whether or not people who are coming to this country as immigrants, or people who are even coming to this country as undocumented immigrants, are a risk, a threat to the United States compared to natural-born citizens. This is a study that Donald Trump's Department of Justice released. This isn't Joe Biden, this isn't Barack Obama. This is Donald Trump's Department of Justice released a study that found, quote, undocumented immigrants had substantially lower crime rates than native-born citizens and legal immigrants across a range of felony offenses. That's the truth. It's Donald Trump's truth. That in fact, people who come to this country, whether legal immigrants or without documentation, are not committing crimes at a greater rate than natural-born Americans. That doesn't excuse our broken system. That is not an argument to continue to allow so many people to come to this country without documentation. It just means that we shouldn't set on fire these arguments that we have something unique to fear. Why? Because these people are coming to the United States for a better life. These people are coming to the United States to flee terror and torture, persecution, violence, and economic destitution. There are criminals amongst their midst. There are individuals who end up committing crimes, but at no greater rate of offense than people who were born in this country. It's just important to acknowledge that. I want to talk about 4 of these myths very quickly. The first one is that President Biden had the authority to keep Title 42 in place. That's just not true. For the better part of the last 2 years, Republicans, conservatives, the broader right, has been pillaring President Biden for not lifting COVID authorities fast enough. The pandemic's over, the right says. Why do we still have these restrictions on our movement? Why are there still restrictions on air travel? Interestingly, the only restriction that Republicans wanted to keep in place was the one at the border that stopped people from coming into the United States that looked different than them. The pandemic is over. Title 42 can't stay in place. The president doesn't have the legal authority to continue to turn people around and deny them the right to apply for asylum. And so it is just not true that this is President Biden's choice. And if you are a constitutionalist, if you are somebody that believes that the president cannot and should not exceed his constitutional statutory authority, then you have to support the lifting of Title 42. Now, we could change the law, and there are proposals here to do that, but President Biden can't keep Title 42 in place any longer than he declares a broader public health emergency. The second myth is, and I've heard this from some of my colleagues here, is that everything was great under President Trump and it exploded under President Biden. In fact, sometimes you hear this stat that crossings were at a historic low under President Trump. Well, that is true to the extent that gas prices were at a historic low under President Trump, because crossings were at a historic low for 1 year, for 2020, when we were in the middle of the teeth of the pandemic, and nobody was going anywhere. Yes, during that period of time, when we shut down the border, when nobody in the United States was moving, when nobody in Mexico was moving, we did have a relatively low number of crossings. But just before the pandemic, when President Trump was in office, we had a historically high number of crossings. In 2019, 800,000 people showed up at the border. That was twice the number for the previous decade on average. During President Obama's time in office, in the first few years of President Trump, about 400,000 people were showing up. Then in 2019, the number spiked to 800,000. They go down for 1 year, but they came back up as soon as the worst of the pandemic abated. And so it's just not true that this problem was a creation of President Biden's swearing in. Numbers were abnormally high right before the pandemic, and they started jumping back up once the pandemic started to lessen in its severity. The third myth is that President Biden didn't prepare for the end of Title 42. That's also not true. And I gave you that statistic to show that, in fact, crossings right now are half what they were right before Title 42 expired. Now, I can't divine all the reasons for that, and maybe those numbers are temporary, but it is definitely true that President Biden has taken extraordinary steps to be ready for this moment, even while Congress refused to act and give him any help. President Biden surged thousands of troops to the border. He put more asylum officers there. He moved Border Patrol. He signed agreements with Mexico in which Mexico agreed to take a certain number of individuals who are coming from countries like Venezuela and Cuba. And he implemented a really tough new asylum rule, a rule that, frankly, many people on his political left say went beyond his statutory authority. But that rule says that you actually cannot apply for asylum at the border unless you've applied beforehand in a safe third country or you've made an appointment. That's a really innovative, tough new approach to try to reduce the number of crossings and presentations at the border, a step that, frankly, President Trump didn't even entertain. So it is just not true to say that President Biden hasn't done anything. In fact, he's taken extraordinary steps to try to be as ready as he can, which leads me to the fourth and final myth, which is that this is just all President Biden's problem. It's not. It's our problem. We haven't significantly updated the immigration laws of this country since the 1980s or 90s. It's been 30 years since we have changed the laws of this nation to reflect the changing nature of migration globally and the changing nature of migration to the United States. We, through our inaction, have left president after president, Republican and Democrat, with a mess because our laws don't work. Our immigration system is broken. And yet, we blame the president for failing to be able to work miracles out of a system that has been fundamentally rendered ineffective. And let's be very clear, Republicans have had ample opportunity to fix the laws of this nation. In 2013, when the presiding officer and I got to the Senate, there was a deal on the table to fundamentally and comprehensively reform our immigration laws. Republicans in the Senate joined with Democrats to get that done, but the Republican Speaker of the House refused to have a vote on it in the House. Since then, there have been a number of efforts to reach out and try to find compromise with Republicans, and it has generally been the Republican Party, writ large, that has decided that there's too big a political cost for them to pay in trying to find common ground on immigration reform. Now, I say that that is a position of the Republican Party writ large because I do know and believe there are individual Republican senators in this body who do want to find compromise, who do want to recognize that this cannot be solved by any president so long as the laws of this nation don't provide resources to move asylum claims faster, don't give Border Patrol what they need, don't allow enough people to come into this country through legal pathways. And part of the reason that I'm down here on the floor today trying to correct these myths and untruths is because I think it is a necessary predicate in order for us as a body, Republicans and Democrats, to sit down and talk about solving this problem. The lack of action in Congress has left President Biden an impossible task. He's done the best that he conceivably can with a set of broken laws. But instead of spreading these myths and often outright lies about what's happening at the border and the consequences of lifting Title 42, we should, as a body, instead do our job and fix our broken immigration laws. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
I heard a very similar speech last week when Senator Paul came to the floor to offer this exact same resolution, and I came to the floor to offer the exact same objection. And I guess we're going to be here next week and the week after having this same back and forth on the Senate floor. I don't know that this is the most important problem facing the country today. The question of whether a small number of Senate pages have a vaccine or not. I think Senator Paul's obsession with page vaccine policy is a little weird and not squared with the actual priorities of the American public. But I'll continue to come down here and object because it's important to know that there is no legal mandate that pages be vaccinated. It's a policy, not a mandate. Senator Paul is proposing a mandate through this resolution that under no circumstances can pages be required to have a vaccination as a condition of their employment here. I find Senator Paul's recitation of his body of evidence interesting. I don't dispute the fact that the vaccine today is much more efficacious on preventing serious illness and is not, like prior vaccines, effective at preventing transmission. But here's the two things to say about that. Senator Paul says over and over again that if you're a healthy kid, you have nothing to worry about, that no healthy kids are dying. Okay, that's broadly true. It is true that healthy children have very little risk of dying of COVID. But The assumption then is that every single page as part of this program has no pre-existing conditions, that every single page comes here with a clean bill of health. That is not true. There are pages here, just like our employees, who have pre-existing conditions. And we have a responsibility for the young people that work for us. We have a long history in this country of requiring vaccinations for young people. Senator Paul objects to that policy. But it is long accepted that young people, during their school-aged years, should have a set of vaccinations to keep them healthy. And if you have a pre-existing condition, even as a child, you have a potential of dying from COVID. Guess what? COVID is the 8th leading cause of death for young people today. That's not insignificant. And so it is perfectly consistent with the general policy we have in this country of requiring students to get vaccines to require the same of the page population, who, by the way, are students. The second thing to say about this resolution is this. Even if Senator Paul is correct, and I broadly would submit that he is, that this vaccine is really about preventing serious illness, not about preventing transmission, this resolution is permanent. This says that under no circumstances should a Senate page be required to have a vaccination. But what if a follow-on vaccine is more effective at preventing transmission? What if the next COVID variant is a more significant threat to children? This is a mandate. This is no matter what the scientific recommendations are, under no circumstances, no matter what the scientific recommendation is, can you require that a Senate page, as a condition of working in the Senate, have a vaccination? That's bad policy. I would rather have this question be up to the attending physician, to the adults who run the page program, than have mandates from the United States Senate about the health care policy of our pages. I think this is really bad policy. But I also think it's super dangerous. Because really, the question of whether a handful of pages in the Senate have a vaccine is not worthy of a half an hour of back and forth between two United States senators. What this ends up being is yet another wedge to try to drive apart the American public from a belief in science and vaccines. This is a long-standing effort by Senator Paul and others to question the efficacy of vaccines. It feeds into a broader narrative about the efficacy of science writ large, and that has devastating consequences for this country. Because as people lose faith in medical recommendations, as less people get vaccines because they come under the belief that the vaccine will do more harm than good, people die. And so by itself, this is bad policy, because this is part of a broad consensus in this country that students should get vaccinated for significant conditions, and this policy stands no matter what the future recommendations of medical professionals are. But I object to it just as strongly because of how it fits in to this broader, incredibly dangerous narrative to try to undermine people's faith in science and vaccines. And for that reason, Mr. President, I would object.
In the aftermath of the barbaric massacre committed by Iran-backed terrorist organization Hamas, there's been significant attention given to the United States Senate, to the $6 billion the Biden administration unfroze as part of a ransom deal with Iran. This is understandable. Because money is fungible, the combination of waivers and non-enforcement of sanctions has enabled Iran to spend billions of dollars bankrolling terrorists, including Hamas. This $6 billion was just the latest installment of an enormous windfall the Iranian regime has enjoyed ever since Joe Biden took office. But not enough attention has been paid to the way Congress has willingly abdicated its responsibility and allowed the executive branch to get away with a reckless policy of appeasement towards Iran. According to many recent news reports this year, the Biden administration was negotiating an unwritten agreement with Iran in which the United States would relieve billions of dollars of sanctions on Iran in return for a number of Iranian promises. One of the architects of this strategy of pursuing an informal and unwritten agreement with Iran as part of a broader strategy of appeasing the Iranians was none other than Rob Malley. Rob Malley was placed on unpaid leave by the State Department in June. He's had his security clearance suspended amid a probe into the possibility that he mishandled classified material. The results have been catastrophic. Iran has received tens of billions of dollars in revenue it would not have received had sanctions been properly enforced. Iran's continued to obstruct nuclear inspection efforts, and its proxies have continued engaging in terrorism across the region, most recently and most tragically in Israel. Furthermore, rewarding hostage-taking by paying $6 billion for the potential release of 5 American hostages, as the Biden administration recently did, as just one element of this unwritten agreement, it only incentivizes more hostage-taking of U.S. citizens abroad, both by Iran and by other adversaries. To that point, as of now, it appears that Iran-backed Hamas is holding 13 American citizens hostage in Gaza. Let me be clear. I believe the Biden administration's Iran policies are deeply misguided and threaten the security of Americans and of our partners and allies in the Middle East. But I'm not here today to debate the pros and cons of resurrecting the Iran deal or any specific agreement the Biden administration has made with Iran. The massacre in Israel last week should have settled that debate, though I suspect we'll likely continue to have that debate in the months ahead. Rather, Mr. President, I'm here today to argue for preserving the role of Congress amid concern that the Biden administration has continuously refused to enforce sanctions as part of a gradually unfolding agreement with Iran, and is doing so in such a manner that's designed to circumvent its legal obligation to submit an agreement to revive the Iran nuclear deal to Congress for review and for an up or down vote. When President Obama pursued the original Iran nuclear deal, his administration blatantly disregarded its constitutional duty to submit the agreement as a treaty, requiring the advice and the consent of 2/3 of the Senate. In response, Congress passed a law known as the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, or INARA, by a vote of 99-1. In brief, the INARA law says that if the United States and Iran make any agreement related to Iran's nuclear program, the White House must submit it for congressional review and potential up or down votes in the Senate and the House of Representatives. The nearly unanimous bipartisan passage of INARA by the Senate reflected the senators' bipartisan frustration that the executive branch was ignoring the Constitution and trying to circumvent Congress on such an important matter. And yet, since taking office, the Biden administration has disregarded its legal obligations under INARA, and the U.S. Congress has allowed this administration to get away with it. If the multitude of reports are accurate, the Biden administration was intentionally avoiding calling its unfolding agreement with Iran an official agreement. That was an effort to, again, sidestep congressional approval that's required under INARA. In early 2021, I was concerned that this might happen, so I introduced the Iran Sanctions Relief Act, or ISRRA, in the 117th Congress and reintroduced it in the 118th Congress. As a backup to INARA, my bill requires congressional review and an up or down vote on any presidential waiver of Iran sanctions, whether that's labeled as an agreement or not. My bill borrows a provision from the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or CAATSA, that overwhelmingly passed Congress back in 2017. The CAATSA provision allows for congressional review and an up or down vote on any presidential waiver of Russian sanctions. My bill takes word for word that same provision and applies it to any presidential waiver of Iran sanctions. This is important because any new agreement to revive the Iran deal will require, once again, the executive branch to waive Iran sanctions. Additionally, in light of reports that the $6 billion the Biden administration unfroze was part of the larger unwritten and informal agreement with Iran, Congress would have had the opportunity to object before the money was unfrozen had my bill had the force of law. In other words, my bill protects the role of Congress as the executive branch continues to ignore its legal obligations and refuses to submit a new agreement to the Senate and to the House. So far, 41 senators have co-sponsored the Iran Sanctions Relief Review Act. This number is significant because 41 senators would be more than enough to deny the Senate's advice and consent if the executive branch actually followed the Constitution and presented a new Iran agreement to the Senate as a treaty. The House companion to this bill has passed through the House Foreign Affairs Committee with bipartisan support. We must protect the first branch of government from an executive branch that seeks to encroach it or to ignore it. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Excuse me. Mr. President, as in a legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Foreign Relations Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-2210 and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, no one is proposing lifting sanctions on Iran. This is a legislative proposal seeking to solve a problem that simply does not exist. So let's make that clear from the outset. Second, the Biden administration has been incredibly tough on Iran. Frankly, the Biden administration has drawn a lot of criticism from people like me for not re-engaging in the JCPOA. Instead, the Biden administration decided to drive a harder bargain with the Iranians. It is also not true that the Biden administration has not implemented new and additional sanctions on Iran. In fact, just a month ago, the Treasury Department announced the 13th round of new sanctions on Iran, mostly relative to the brutal suppression of the protest movement inside of that country. And so it's important to get the record straight in terms of what this administration's record has been on Iran. And it's also important for us to not create some fantasy world in which the prior administration's Iran policy was working. President Trump's Iran policy was an unmitigated disaster, an absolute disaster. Whatever you think about the JCPOA, there is just no question that after we withdrew from the JCPOA, a set of very bad things happened. One, Iran started shooting at American troops inside Iraq and inside Syria, something that was not happening during the Obama administration while we were in the JCPOA. Second, their support for proxy groups continued to increase, including to groups like Hamas. Third, they restarted their nuclear research program. They are now 1 month away from a nuclear weapon. And fourth, the coalition that had been assembled to organize efforts to contain and to isolate Iran fell apart. And so let's not put a gloss on what was a disastrous Iran policy under the previous regime. But as to the senator's proposal, even if we have disagreements on the JCPOA or on Iran policy, this proposed legislation is just really bad policy. It's really bad policy, and it will make American sanctions much weaker and much less effective. Why is that? What this proposal suggests is that for Iran sanctions, every time you lift or waive a sanction, you have to come to Congress. Now, we have sanctions levied against, I would guess, thousands of Iranian institutions, organizations, and individuals. And the purpose of sanctions is to change behavior, right? It's not just punishment. Sanctions are about delivering a consequence to an individual, an organization, or a country for their bad behavior as a means of trying to get them to change that behavior. And once they change that behavior, the sanction is lifted. That's why Congress traditionally does not require a separate congressional review process, a separate congressional vote every time an administration lifts a sanction, because you need for an administration to be nimble in applying sanctions and also lifting sanctions. Because if a foreign individual in Iran or any other place understands that in order for a sanction to be lifted, not only does the administration have to lift it, but Congress has to have a debate and a vote, it is no incentive to change behavior. So I just think this is really bad policy. Whether or not you like President Biden's Iran policy, and I do, whether or not you supported the JCPOA, tying the administration's hands on sanction policy in this way just makes the sanctions much less effective. I get it that Republicans don't like Joe Biden, and they don't like Joe Biden's foreign policy. But this would be bad under a Republican president as well. I am very glad to work with my colleague on increasing the role that Congress plays on broad foreign policy decisions. But I think that there are some day-to-day administrations of foreign policy, like the decision as to when to waive or lift a particular individual sanction, that would become far too burdensome and contrary to national security interests if Congress got involved to the degree that this legislation suggests. And so for that reason, simply because I think this is bad policy, whether this was about Iran policy or Venezuela policy or Russia policy, I just think it makes our sanctions policy much harder to effectuate and ultimately makes our sanctions regimes weaker, not stronger. For those reasons, I would object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard. Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I would welcome the opportunity to work with my colleague, Senator Murphy, on sanctions policies that make sense. But I would say this: if this policy is good enough for CAATSA and Russia, why wouldn't it be good enough for Iran? The Senate has already passed CAATSA. I've just used the exact language. I'd also like to say this: if it's true that this administration is not waiving sanctions and is not entering an agreement, they should have no difficulty with this level of review. I don't believe that's the case. And I'd also like to address the accusations, I should say, leveled against the policy in the last administration after the withdrawal of the JCPOA. Iran never stopped their nuclear program. Israel, through a very brave and courageous raid, proved that. They were continuing on that path. As part of my prior job as U.S. Ambassador to Japan, it was my responsibility to get Japan to stop buying Iranian crude. I was successful at that after many rounds of negotiation. We cut Iran's fund flows down to a trickle. That starved Iran's ability to fund its proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah. In fact, it was widely reported in the media that Hamas and Hezbollah were going broke. That all changed when the policy of appeasement came back in 2021. By avoiding sanctions, by not enforcing sanctions, the estimates are as high as $80 billion of fresh oil, illicit oil revenues that have entered Iran's coffers. We know about the payment that was allowed by Iraq to Iran by this administration. Senator Cotton just addressed this. And the $6 billion that's received so much scrutiny in the media just recently. All of this has enriched Iran. All of this has put Iran in a better position to fund its proxies and fuel them. And I think all of this is part of a very misguided policy of appeasement. I yield the floor.
Madam President, before I explain my amendment, I would like to yield 30 seconds to my good friend Senator Tester.
Mr. President, I rise in support of the Kennedy Amendment, in support of Second Amendment rights for veterans in Montana and across this country. It is not right that a D.C. bureaucrat at the VA can take away a veteran's legal right to their firearm simply because they need assistance managing their finances. I'll tell you what a Montana advocate for veterans told me. Said this VA's long-standing policy to threaten veterans' constitutional rights who ask for help managing their affairs has been a barrier to veterans to receive help for years. It's time to end it so veterans can reach out for the financial help they need and the mental health they need. I agree, and I don't believe someone who has served this country needs a fiduciary to have to hire a lawyer to go back to court to get their Second Amendment rights. I yield back to Senator Kennedy.
Madam President, there's 16 million veterans in our country. Sometimes some of them need help managing their financial affairs. When they do, they go to the Veterans Administration, and the Veterans Administration appoints a fiduciary to help that veteran manage his or her financial affairs. But under current VA policy, can we have order, Madam President? Under current VA policy, get this, under current VA policy, if a veteran who defended this country has to go to the VA and ask for help managing his or her financial affairs, the VA automatically reports that veteran to the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check System, we call it NICS, and that veteran loses his firearm. He loses his firearm automatically. No due process. No questions asked. This decision has not been made by a judge. It's being made by a bureaucrat. All our amendment would do would be to say the VA, just because you've asked for help with your money, cannot automatically take away your firearm or report you to NICS unless a judge has ruled that that veteran is a danger to himself or to others. And I would like to reserve the balance of my time.
The junior senator from Connecticut.
Madam President, I thought one of the few things that we agreed on firearms was that people with serious mental illness, people who are judged to be mentally incompetent, shouldn't be able to buy guns. And that's what we're talking about here today. We are not talking about people who just can't balance their checkbook. We're not talking about people who just need some assistance with their financial affairs. The standard that the VA uses is the standard of mental incompetence. These are veterans who have been judged to be mentally incapacitated. And let me put a finer point on it. 1/3 of the veterans we're talking about in this category are diagnosed schizophrenics. And this amendment allows for every single one of them to have their gun rights restored. Some of the most mentally ill people in this nation, people to whom we owe a duty of care, people who are frankly more prone to suicide than the general population, are now going to be able to get their hands on a weapon to kill themselves or others if we pass this. This is a death sentence for scores of deeply mentally ill veterans. What it does not do is set up some process by which to have a court judge whether or not they should own a gun. In fact, there is no current cause of action for that to occur. And we didn't have to be at this point where our only choice is to restore gun rights even to actively suicidal veterans. We made an offer to sit down and try to work out a compromise, a better appeals process, a mechanism for these veterans to go to court. But that did not happen. That offer was not accepted. And so instead, Madam President, we are voting on an amendment that gives gun rights back to every single seriously mentally ill veteran who've been judged to be mentally incompetent, even those that are actively suicidal. That is a death sentence for thousands of seniors, thousands of veterans all across this country if this becomes law. This is a terrible idea, and we should defeat it.
The junior senator from Louisiana.
Madam President, with all the respect I can muster, my colleague what he has said is inaccurate. Now, I understand this is America. You can believe what you want. There's some people that wish we didn't have a second amendment. I get that, but we do. And I agree with Senator Murphy. We both agree on this. Chris believes that love is the answer, and I do too. But I own a handgun just in case, and that's my right. And every veteran has that right. And we shouldn't take away a person's gun without a judge, not a bureaucrat at the VA, ruling that person mentally incompetent.